America wants its exporters and by implication its workers to be treated much more fairly. We want American markets, in the same way that American markets have been open to a lot of European goods, we'd like a lot of European markets to be open to American goods.
In other words, it's indirectly our defense also.
We just want a little bit more fairness, or to use the president's favorite word, reciprocity. And again, with Europe, we think that's a very, very easy conversation to have. We hope our European friends agree.
In a strategic deal with China, maybe even including on Taiwan.
But the fundamental principle is we think that most nations in the world have been way too hard on American exporters and American firms. We want to make the entire world a little bit more open to the products built by American workers. We're obviously biased. We think that they're the best in the world. And we think that we can have a much better trading relationship with a lot of our European friends if they just drop some of those both tariff but also non-tariff trade barriers. There are regulatory barriers. There are sometimes you have an official at the Ministry of Defense. We have to be careful here because while we want to rebalance global trade, and that has certainly been the explicit goal of our policy, we also want to make sure that we do this in the right way. And yes, you've seen media reports that the Chinese reached out to the United States. Of course, we're going to sit down and talk to them. I'm not going to divulge too many details or prejudge the negotiations, but we want to rebalance trade in the interests of American workers, in the interests of American manufacturers. That is our policy. We think that we can do that while preserving at least an open dialogue with the PRC and with a lot of other nations all over the world. But that doesn't mean the old way of doing business is going to be stable or that it's going to persist. It simply cannot. It was not sustainable 10 years ago. It was certainly not sustainable 4 years ago, and we're very, very committed to changing it. But we're open to having conversations with both, again, our friends and more adversarial nations about what that rebalancing ultimately looks like. And people have to remember, you know, Liberation Day, which was where the president announced this fundamental change, I think, in the global trading system, that was almost exactly 30 days ago. So we are in the early innings of a very significant shift. I think that shift is going to really inure to the benefit of both the United States, but also of Europe. But it's fundamentally, it has to happen, and it's going to happen under President Trump's leadership.
A replay of the earlier, agreement that was reached 10 years ago.
But I think all of us, including especially the United States, we have to be careful that we don't draw the lines in such a way that we actually undermine the very democratic legitimacy upon which all of our civilization rests. And I think that is fundamentally the point here. It's not Europe bad, America good. It's that I think that both Europe and the United States, we got a little bit off track, and I'd encourage us all to get back on track together. We're certainly willing and able to participate in that work, and I think all of you all too. Thank you. God bless you.
Great. Thank you so much. Could you talk a little bit about U.S. strategy going forward?
And certainly the first peace offer that the Russians put on the table, our reaction to it was, you're asking for too much, but this is how negotiations unfold. And I wouldn't say, I'm not yet that pessimistic on this, I wouldn't say that the Russians are uninterested in bringing this thing to a resolution. What I would say is right now, the Russians are asking for a certain set of requirements, a certain set of concessions in order to end the conflict. We think they're asking for too much. Okay, and then obviously the Ukrainians matter a lot. They're the other side. They're the other party, at least to the direct conflict. And we have to ask, what is the Ukrainian? What do they need in order to bring this conflict to a successful completion? And we're going to continue to have that conversation. Now, what the president has said is that he will walk away if he thinks he's not making progress. And I think that about once every 4 or 5 weeks, you will hear some American official or sometimes multiple American officials say, this is a week where we need to make another step. And in particular, the step that we would like to make right now is we would like both the Russians and the Ukrainians to actually agree on some basic guidelines for sitting down and talking to one another. Obviously, the United States is happy to participate in those conversations, but it's very important for the Russians and the Ukrainians to start talking to one another. We think that is the next big step that we would like to take. And why does that matter? The reason it matters is because, again, I mentioned the Russians, but also the Ukrainians have also been sort of, they've put a piece of paper in our hands that says this is what we would need in order to bring this conflict to a successful resolution from our perspective. And there's a big gulf, predictably, between where the Russians and the Ukrainians are, and we think the next step in the negotiation is to try to close that gulf. We think it's probably impossible for us to mediate this entirely without at least some direct negotiation between the two, and so that's what we focused on.
If that's the assessment, if that's our collective assessment,
A frustration that we've had, frankly, with both sides, is that they hate each other so much that if you have an hour conversation with either side, the first 30 minutes are just them complaining about some historical grievance from 4 years ago or 5 years ago or 10 years ago. Look, I understand it. I understand that people don't fight wars against each other without a lot of grievance and a lot of problem, but we're trying to, as much as we can, play a constructive role in advancing the peace conversation forward.
U.S. strategy going forward.
Yeah, so I haven't seen those reports that you mentioned, a strategic deal on Taiwan, so I wouldn't speak to that. I certainly would say that there has been no conversation between our governments about a strategic deal on that particular question. What we have talked about, of course, is that we cannot absorb the producer surplus of the entire world.
If that's the assessment, if that's our collective assessment,
We think that the PRC is going to have to, frankly, let their own population consume a little bit more. They've held consumption levels down in order to increase these massive exports. It means that American manufacturers are going to have to be treated more fairly in some of these global trade deals. It means we're going to have to cut some new trade deals with some of our friends in Europe, but also with some of our more adversarial nations. But that also, we have to be careful here, because while we want to rebalance global trade, and that has certainly been the explicit goal of our policy, we also want to make sure that we do this in the right way. And yes, you've seen media reports that the Chinese reached out to the United States. Of course, we're going to sit down and talk to them. I'm not going to divulge too many details or prejudge the negotiations, but we want to rebalance trade in the interests of American workers, in the interests of American manufacturers. That is our policy. We think that we can do that while preserving at least an open dialogue with the PRC and with a lot of other nations all over the world. But that doesn't mean the old way of doing business is going to be stable or that it's going to persist. It simply cannot.
2, 3, 4, 5 countries in Europe that would have gone nuclear.